Let me tell you about the day I fixed 17 Vethal warships with 12 meters of salvaged patch cable and a battered junction shunt I had been meaning to throw away for 6 months. I am not going to make this sound more dramatic than it was. It was not dramatic. It was embarrassing, honestly. Embarrassing for the Vethal Imperial Navy's three-man nav engineering team. Embarrassing for the station commander who told me twice to go back to my bay. And only slightly embarrassing for me, because I recognized the fault in the first 40 seconds, and then had to stand in a corridor for 6 hours while 3 people with university seals on their collars tried to fix it wrong in every possible direction before anyone let me near the junction box. But I am getting ahead of myself. You probably want to know who I am and what I was doing on a Vethal Joint Operations tether station in the first place. My name is Cale Oren. I am 38 years old. I hold a Terran General Mechanics certification, a Terran Vethal Interface Systems endorsement, level II, which is the highest a human is permitted to sit without a Vethal co-signature, and a cluster of smaller endorsements that amount to. I can fix almost anything that runs on a power relay, whether it was built on Earth or not. I have been doing this work for 19 years, since I was 19 years old and my uncle handed me a multi-tool in his garage bay on the outskirts of Caledon City and said, "If you can figure out why this relay box is throwing a short address fault, I'll pay you for the afternoon." I figured it out. He paid me for the afternoon. I never really stopped. The relay box, as it turned out, had a miswired address terminal. Someone had transposed 2 leads during a previous repair, which caused the box to try to claim the same node address as its neighbor, which made both of them throw faults until one gave up and went offline. The fix was to swap the leads back to where they belonged. The whole job took about 20 minutes once I understood what I was looking at. My uncle watched me do it and then watched me put his tools away without being asked, and he did not say much. But the next afternoon, he called me back and handed me a more complicated problem. A relay cascade in his vehicle bay that 3 different certified technicians had looked at and walked away from. I fixed that one too. It took 2 days and a lot of reading, but I fixed it. That is more or less the story of my career, repeated in various forms across 19 years and 6 different postings, 2 of which were on Terran colonial stations, 2 on joint Terran Vethal installations, 1 on an Orvith-flagged trade hub where I learned more about non-human relay architecture than I had in my entire prior career, and finally here on Ardith 7, where I have now been for 3 years and where I expect to stay for at least 3 more. Tether Station Ardith 7 is not a glamorous posting. It sits in a medium-high orbit above Vethos Secondary, which is a gas collection world that nobody wants to live on, but everybody wants the processed fuel from. The station exists because you need somewhere to service the tanker ships that haul the fuel out, somewhere to run the manifold coupling lines between civilian infrastructure and military resupply, and somewhere for human and Vethal maintenance crews to work side by side, theoretically in harmony, practically in a state of cordial mutual bafflement. There are about 400 souls on the station at any given time. A little over 100 of them are human. The rest are Vethal, plus a scattering of Orvith dock hands and 2 Mervi contract engineers who mostly keep to themselves and smell faintly of copper. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of place I have always ended up. The intersection of 2 systems that were designed by people who were not quite talking to each other, requiring someone whose main skill is understanding both sides of the gap. I have spent most of my career at that intersection. I had been on Ardith 7 for 3 years when the 7th Vethal Expeditionary Fleet arrived. They were not supposed to arrive, or rather, they were supposed to arrive 2 weeks later, after a scheduled refuel stop at Station Ardith 9 farther out in the sector. What happened at Ardith 9 I was not told in any detail. Something about a manifold integrity failure that made the station temporarily unusable for capital ship docking, and so Fleet Admiral Sorville Ethan, commanding 17 warships of various classes, rerouted to us. 17 warships. I want you to understand what that means on a station like Ardith 7. We are built to handle a maximum of 6 capital-class vessels at a time without stressing the docking arm structure. 6 is the engineering limit that was set when the station was designed, and while the station has been expanded twice since then, the docking arm structure has never been upgraded. 17 meant they were mooring in a stacked tanker formation outside the station's direct docking range, with service shuttles running back and forth to handle resupply and crew transfers. It meant the station's power grid was running at 112% of nominal, which is within tolerance, but makes all the lights in the lower bays flicker in a way that I find personally irritating. It meant the nav relay grid, the system that handles positioning handshakes between the station and every vessel in its operational zone, was suddenly being asked to manage about 3 times as many simultaneous external connections as it was designed for. And it meant every maintenance crew on the station, human and Vethal alike, had been working double shifts for 36 hours before I walked into the middle of what would become the main event of my career. The atmosphere on the station during those 36 hours was the particular kind of controlled urgency that experienced crews fall into when something abnormal is happening, but nothing has gone wrong yet. A state of managed pressure, not panic, where everyone has a job and is doing it and the whole system bends but does not break. Everyone moved a little faster than usual. Conversations were shorter. People ate at their stations, or grabbed something from the extended catering shifts. The mess hall was running rather than sitting down for a proper meal. The corridors that were normally quiet during the third watch were full of Vethal logistics personnel wheeling cargo manifests and fuel transfer authorizations back and forth on their portable consoles, the low hum of their equipment mixing with the elevated ventilation noise that always comes when the station's power grid is running above nominal. The shuttle bay ran continuous traffic, supply pods going out to the fleet, personnel transfers coming back, the shuttle operators working rotation schedules that left almost no gap between flights. I passed through the shuttle bay twice during those 36 hours on other errands, and both times the place had the specific organized chaos of a facility doing twice its intended work. Queues of equipment pallets staged in every available meter of floor space. The bay chief, a veteran Vethal named Corvan, standing in the center of it all and directing traffic with the calm authority of someone who has managed worse. He had been on Ardith 7 for 12 years. He had seen fleet visits before, though not one of this size. I crossed paths with him briefly at the manifest terminal on the second day. He looked at me with the expression that experienced station crew tend to share during a high-pressure event. The mutual recognition of people who understand that the work will get done because it always gets done, and that this particular variety of pressure will eventually pass. "You holding up?" he said. "Fine," I said. "You?" "I've been better," he said. "I've been worse." He went back to his manifest. That was most of the conversation I had during those 36 hours that was not directly related to a work order. Everyone was working. I had been awake for 19 of those 36 hours when the fault alarm went up. I want to tell you about the station's architecture first, though, because the station architecture is the heart of the story. Ardith 7 runs on a hybrid power and navigation relay architecture. That is a fancy way of saying it was built in 2 phases, 20 years apart, by 2 different contracting teams who did not talk to each other enough. The original Vethal-built core uses a Class IV Vethal node addressing protocol, clean, elegant, and 50 years old, originally designed for single-species installations where every terminal in the network speaks the same addressing language. The human-built extension, added when Terran-Vethal joint operations became policy, uses a Terran interface standard relay framework, which is also clean and elegant, but uses a completely different node addressing logic, developed independently and optimized for different installation conditions. The two systems talk to each other through a translation layer, a set of junction boxes that map Vethal addresses to Terran addresses and vice versa. And that translation layer works perfectly well as long as nobody asks it to handle more simultaneous connections than it was designed for. Nobody had ever asked it to handle 17 warships simultaneously before. I had been on shift for 11 hours when the fault alarm went up. I was in Bay 3 lower at the time, replacing a cracked coupling sleeve on a Vethal tanker's secondary feed line. A straightforward job, the kind of thing I can do in my sleep. The kind of job I could probably finish with one hand tied behind my back at this point in my career, and still do it right. I heard the alarm, finished sealing the coupling sleeve because I was not going to leave it half done, checked the seal with my probe, checked it again, cleaned my hands on my work rag, and pulled up the fault summary on my wrist screen. The fault code read, Cascade Navgrid Address Collision, SECTORS 7 through 23, all external mooring links affected. I looked at that for about 4 seconds. Then I pulled up the station's junction box schematic on my wrist screen. The old schematic I had been carrying in my saved files since my first week on the station, because I had learned early on that the official schematics in the station's maintenance database were subtly wrong in 3 places, and I had corrected them myself, and I traced the cascade path. It took me 40 seconds. The fault was straightforward. When the 7th Fleet arrived and established mooring link handshakes with the station's nav relay grid, the junction translation layer had been given more simultaneous external address requests than its node mapping table could hold. The table had overflowed, which caused the addressing protocol to loop back to the beginning of its index, which meant 17 ships' navigation handshakes were all trying to share the same address blocks. The grid had not crashed, it was still running, but it was running in a state of total address confusion, which meant every ship in the fleet that was linked to the station's nav relay was effectively navigation blind. They could fire their engines. They could maneuver on internal heading systems. But they could not trust their own grid coordinates relative to the station or to each other, which meant they could not safely execute the kind of coordinated formation, maneuvering that a fleet needs to do, which meant they were 17 very large ships sitting in a holding pattern and going nowhere until the grid came back clean. The fix, in principle, was also straightforward. You needed to bridge 2 specific node terminals in Junction Box 7 secondary, the box that handled the Terran to Vethal address translation for all external mooring links, with a shunt cable that would force the address table to index from a secondary reference point instead of the primary one, effectively giving the translation layer twice the address space it thought it had. The shunt cable did not need to be anything special. It needed to be 12 meters long, rated for low-power data relay, and patched into the right 2 terminals. The terminals were labeled in the version 4.7 documentation as J7S114 and J7S229, which I knew because I had read the version 4.7 documentation in my first month on the station, when I was doing what I always do at a new posting, reading every piece of technical documentation I can find until I understand the installation I am living in. I had a cable in my kit that was almost exactly 12 meters long. I had salvaged it from a decommissioned junction housing 3 months earlier, intending to strip it for parts. When I checked it, the data contacts were perfect, clean pins, firm seating action, good signal continuity down the full length. The outer sleeve had a slightly scuffed section near one end that made it look like a cable someone had been meaning to throw away, which was technically accurate. I closed my wrist screen, picked up my tool bag, and walked toward Junction Box 7 secondary. I got as far as the entrance to Corridor J7, which is the maintenance corridor that leads to the junction box, when I found the Vethal nav engineering team. There were 3 of them. They had arrived fast, the kind of fast that means they were already on alert and had a pre-planned response protocol for this category of fault. That, at least, spoke well of their preparation. They were standing in a loose cluster around a portable diagnostic console they had wheeled in from somewhere, and they were running what looked like a full deep scan of the station's nav relay architecture. The kind of diagnostic procedure that takes about 2 hours to complete and is designed to identify faults by elimination, systematically ruling out every possible cause one at a time, starting from the hardware and working upward. All three of them had the Vethal Imperial Navy's Technical Corps insignia on their collars, 2 silver rings and a small engraved crest, which means senior grade. They were, by the standards of the Vethal military technical establishment, the people who were supposed to be good at this. Their equipment was current fleet issue, better than anything on Ardith 7's station inventory. Their diagnostic suite was thorough. It was just designed for a different kind of problem. I stopped at the entrance to the corridor. The nearest of the three, a tall Vethal with pale silver-blue skin and the slightly pinched expression of someone who has been awake too long and is not happy about it, looked at me. "Maintenance Bay," he said. His Terran standard was precise and slightly clipped, the way most Vethal speak it when they are focused on something else. "Yes," I said. "I'm the level II interface systems Endor C on this shift. I think I know what the fault is." He looked at my work coveralls. He looked at my tool bag. He looked back at his diagnostic console. "We have it," he said, and turned back to the screen. I stood in the corridor entrance for a moment. I looked at the diagnostic they were running. I could see from the progress bar that it was about 8% complete. "The scan takes 2 hours," I said. "We are aware," he said without turning around. "Junction Box 7, secondary has an address-stable overflow. If you shunt terminals J7S114 and J7S229 with a low-power data relay cable, the table indexes from the secondary reference and the address space doubles. The cascade clears. I have the cable." All three of them turned to look at me this time. The tall one with the pinched expression said, "The Vethal Terran Interface Protocol does not support secondary reference indexing for external nav handshakes. That is not how the architecture works." "With respect," I said, "it is how this architecture works. The junction boxes on this station were installed by Terran contractors in the second build phase. The Terran Interface Standard Relay Framework has had secondary reference indexing built into its node mapping logic since version 4.2. The version installed here is 4.7. There was a pause, the kind of pause that has a decision inside it. "You are a maintenance mechanic," the tall one said, not unkindly, just stating what he saw. "Yes," I said, "that's correct." "Thank you for the suggestion," he said, and he turned back to his console. I stood there for another moment. I thought about saying more. I decided not to. I went back to Bay 3 lower. I will be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, walking back down the maintenance corridor with my tool bag and my patch cable, because I think it is worth being honest about. I did not feel angry. I have been in this position enough times that anger takes more energy than I have available for it. What I felt was the particular grinding frustration of having the answer and not being allowed to use it. A feeling I have become very familiar with over the course of my career, in a variety of settings, for a variety of reasons that all trace back to the same basic human tendency to read the container before the contents. I sat on the edge of a parts crate in Bay 3 lower and ate the lunch I had not gotten around to eating yet, and I thought about whether to push harder. The thing is, I have learned slowly over many years that there is a right way to push and a wrong way to push, and the wrong way is to argue in the corridor while they are already committed to their scan. It does not get the ships fixed any faster. It just gets you remembered as the difficult human who would not stay in her lane, which makes every subsequent conversation harder. Which is the opposite of useful. If you have been the person in the corridor often enough, you develop a feel for it, when to press again and when to let the situation develop until the evidence is unavoidable. I did not like waiting, but I understood the calculus. So I ate my lunch. I filed the coupling sleeve replacement in my work log. I moved on to a hydraulic line tension check in Bay 4, and then a ventilation filter service in the lower habitation ring, and then a half-dozen smaller items from the maintenance queue that had been waiting their turn. I kept my wrist screen's fault summary open in the corner of my vision, and I kept watching the nav cascade fault sit there unresolved, hour after hour, like a stuck door that nobody would let me open. In the third hour of waiting, I ran into a junior Vethal technician named Cell, crew of the Ardith Veen, part of the fleet's supplemental maintenance detail that had come aboard to assist with the resupply, in the parts storage corridor off Bay 2. He was looking for a specific coupling adapter that was apparently in short supply on his ship. I helped him find it. It was misfiled, as things in the Bay 2 parts storage often are, under a Terran catalog code rather than the Vethal one. He thanked me with the formal half-bow that junior Vethal crew use with civilian maintenance staff, not dismissive, just professional, and then, because we were both standing in the same corridor waiting for nothing in particular, he said, "The Cascade fault. Do they know what it is yet?" "Yes," I said. He looked at me. "The nav engineering team is running diagnostics," I said. "They'll find it." He nodded and went back to his ship with his coupling adapter. I went back to my ventilation filters. At the 4-hour mark, the second diagnostic completed. Another inconclusive result. I heard, through the station's internal communications channel, the fleet's operations staff had begun revising the holding pattern schedule and calculating fuel reserve margins. The fleet had arrived with about 30 hours of holding pattern fuel reserve. 30 hours, minus the 4 they had already spent, minus whatever the third diagnostic would cost them, minus the time after that to actually execute whatever fix the diagnostic eventually pointed toward. The numbers were workable, but they were getting less workable with every hour. I thought about the cable in my kit. I thought about 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I thought about the fact that the fault was still there, unchanged, completely resolvable, while a 3-person team with excellent equipment worked through a methodology that was not going to find it. There is a particular quality of patience required in that situation that I do not think has a clean name. It is not resignation. Resignation implies accepting that the outcome will not be what you want. It is not frustration exactly, though frustration is part of it. It is the patience of someone who knows where the door is and is waiting for permission to open it, and who has learned, through long experience, that the permission is worth waiting for because forcing the door costs something that cannot be easily repaired. The working relationship with the nav engineering team, the station commander's trust in his maintenance staff, the ordinary fabric of cooperation that makes a joint operations station function. All of that is made of small decisions about when to push and when to wait. I waited. At the 6-hour mark, the station commander appeared. His name was Overseer Seth Dallo, Vethal, mid-50s, career station administrator, not a technical man. He was the kind of administrator who ran a good, clean operation, kept his crews supplied and reasonably rested, and trusted his technical leads to handle the technical problems. He had been in charge of Ardith 7 for 8 years, which meant he was competent and experienced, and most of his decisions were good ones. He was also, like most non-technical administrators who oversee technical operations, inclined to trust the person with the most visible credentials in any given situation. He found me in Bay 3 lower, where I had circled back to double-check the coupling sleeve I had sealed 11 hours ago, partly because it was on my list, and partly because I find repetitive physical tasks calming when I am waiting for something I cannot control. He came in, looked around the bay with the expression of a man who has been making rounds and is now at the edge of his comfort zone, and said, without preamble, "The nav engineering team says they have a possible lead. They are running a third diagnostic. They expect a result within the next 2 to 3 hours." "With respect, Overseer," I said, The diagnostic will come back inconclusive again. The fault is an address-stable overflow in junction box 7 secondary. It is not a hardware fault. Their diagnostic suite is designed to find hardware faults. He looked at me the way the tall nav engineer had looked at me, which is to say, he looked at my coveralls. "You are the level II human interface tech," he said. "Yes, Overseer Kale Oren." "The nav engineers are Imperial Navy senior grade." "Yes, Overseer, I understand that." He was quiet for a moment. He was not a cruel man or a dismissive one. He was just doing the institutional calculation that most administrators do in that situation, which is to say, 2 senior-grade Imperial Navy technicians with fleet tissue diagnostic equipment versus 1 human mechanic in stained coveralls with a tool bag. He weighed the credentials. He made the obvious call. "The nav engineering team has been briefed," he said. "They are handling it. I appreciate your input." I looked at him, I said, "Yes, Overseer," and he left. I put down my inspection probe. I sat on the parts crate. I looked at the ceiling of Bay 3 lower, which had a grease stain in one corner that had been there since before I arrived, and would probably still be there when I left. Here is the thing about being the person who knows how to fix something, and not being allowed to fix it. It is not a grand, dramatic feeling. It does not feel like injustice or oppression in the abstract. It feels like watching someone try to open a jar the wrong way, twisting the lid against the thread, and not being able to say anything useful, and knowing that the jar is going to stay shut until they figure out the thread, and the thing inside the jar was supposed to be someone's dinner. It is a grinding, practical frustration. It sits in your chest like a piece of grit. I sat on that crate for about 10 minutes. Then I picked up my tool bag, took out the salvaged patch cable, checked the data contacts one more time. They were fine. They had always been fine, and walked back to corridor J7. The nav engineering team was still there. They had been there for 6 hours. They looked tired, which on a Vethal face means the same as it does on a human face. Slightly dulled eyes, a particular kind of tightness around the mouth, the posture of someone who has been standing at a problem for too long and is starting to feel it in their back. The third diagnostic was running on the portable console, progress bar at about 30%. The tall nav engineer, I would learn his name later, Tech Sorva, senior grade 2nd class, looked up when I came around the corner. His expression was somewhere between weary and carefully patient. "Mechanic," he said. "Tech Sorva," I said. I had read his name from his collar crest. "I am going to ask you to let me try one thing. It will take 4 minutes. If it does not work, I will leave the corridor and I will not come back, and you can finish the diagnostic." He looked at me for a long moment. I think he had been awake for a very long time. I think he was genuinely not a bad person. I had revised my opinion of him somewhat over the previous 6 hours, because I had watched the progress bar through 2 diagnostic cycles and watched him run them cleanly and methodically, the way someone does who takes their work seriously. His problem was not that he was careless. His problem was that he had been trained for a different failure mode. The gap in his knowledge was not his fault. It was in the documentation. But that was also, in this moment, not the most important thing. 4 minutes, he said. 4 minutes, I confirmed. I walked past all 3 of them to junction box 7 secondary. It is a wall-mounted housing about the size of a large suitcase, finished in the gray-green composite Vethal uses for its modular relay infrastructure, with 2 rows of data terminals along the front panel behind a hinged cover. I opened the cover. I counted terminals from the left. J7S114 was in the 2nd row, 6th from the left. J7S229 was in the 2nd row, 21st from the left. I took out my patch cable. I seated one end into J7S114. Pressed until I heard the soft confirmation click, and ran the cable across to J7S229, seated the other end, waited for the 2nd click. The cascade fault alarm, the one that had been sitting at the top of the station's fault display for 6 hours, went quiet. I checked my wrist screen. The nav relay grid was restoring address assignments. External mooring links were re-handshaking, one by one in clean sequential order. The cascade was clearing. The whole thing had taken 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I closed the junction box cover. I coiled the remaining slack of the patch cable loosely and let it hang at the base of the housing. It would need to stay there, patching those 2 terminals, until someone could update the junction box's firmware to expand the address table properly, at which point the cable could come out. I made a note in my wrist screen to file the firmware update request when I got back to my bay. I turned around. All 3 nav engineers were staring at me, not with any particular expression I could name, not angry, not admiring. Something more like the look of a person who has just watched the jar lid come off on the first try after 10 minutes of struggling, and is still processing that the thread ran the other way. Tech Sorva looked from me to the junction box. He looked back at his diagnostic console, where the cascade fault was no longer registering. He looked at me again. "Secondary reference indexing," he said. "Version 4.7, I said. He was quiet for a moment. "It is not in our training documentation for this station's architecture." "It should be," I said. "I'll file the discrepancy note along with the firmware request." I picked up my tool bag and walked back down corridor J7. I will be honest with you, that was the moment I was expecting it to be over. Not with any great recognition. I had not been expecting recognition, but just done. The cable was in. The fault was clear. The ships could navigate again. I could go back to my shift, write up my notes, and by tomorrow it would be a footnote in the station's maintenance log. The nav engineers would file their own report with whatever framing they chose to put on it, and that would be that. That was not what happened. What happened was that I walked out of corridor J7 and nearly into Fleet Admiral Sorville Ethan. I had not known she was on the station. I found out later that she had come aboard 4 hours into the nav cascade fault, traveling over by service shuttle from the fleet's command ship, the Vethal Dreadnought Ardith Veen, the largest vessel in the formation, a ship so long that the station's proximity sensors registered it across 14 different positional markers simultaneously. She had come aboard because she was the kind of fleet commander who wanted to be at the problem, not watching it from a distance. She had been in the command center for the last 2 hours, watching the diagnostic scans come back inconclusive, and when the cascade fault alarm had gone quiet 3 minutes and 40 seconds ago, she had apparently walked straight out of the command center and down through the station's maintenance levels to find out what had changed. She was tall. All Vethal are tall by human standards, but she had the kind of bearing that adds another few centimeters on top of the physical reality. The upright, unhurried posture of someone who has been in command long enough that it has settled into her bones. Her skin was pale silver blue, the shade that in Vethal corresponds to late middle age, with faint luminous tracery at the temples, a natural Vethal biological marker that appears with seniority, not a decoration. She wore an admiral's working uniform, deep blue field jacket with the Vethal fleet insignia across the left breast, dark trousers, low composite boots. She was not in dress uniform. She had come to work, and she looked like someone who was still working. She stopped when she saw me. She looked at the junction box housing over my shoulder, where the patch cable was still faintly visible through the hinged cover. She looked at my tool bag. She looked at my face. "Name and posting," she said. Her Terran standard was flawless. Not clipped or precise in the way of someone translating carefully, genuinely, natively fluent, the way you get only if you have spent years working alongside Terran crews in real operational conditions. "Kale Oren," I said. "Level II Interface Systems, Maintenance Rotation Ardith 7. She was quiet for a moment. Her eyes pale, the particular almost colorless silver of the senior Vethal, moved back to the junction box housing. "You resolved the cascade," she said, "not a question." "Yes, Admiral." "How?" Address stable overflow in the translation junction. I patched a shunt cable across the secondary reference terminals to expand the indexing space. The cable needs to stay in until the firmware gets updated. I've flagged a request for that. It should take a day or two to process through the standard queue. She was looking at me steadily. Not the way the nav engineers had looked at me, not weighing credentials against what she was hearing. Just listening, with the particular focused attention of someone who is used to evaluating information quickly and accurately in conditions where being wrong has consequences. The nav engineering team ran 3 diagnostics, she said. Yes, Admiral. Their diagnostic suite is designed for hardware fault finding. This was a software architecture overflow, different category. And you identified it. In about 40 seconds, yes. I've seen the same fault pattern in Terran civilian junction infrastructure. It's a known failure mode when you exceed the node mapping table's capacity. The version 4.7 documentation describes a secondary reference shunt as the recommended interim fix. The version 4.7 documentation, she said. The Terran Interface Standard, version 4.7, subsection 11.4. Compatibility notes for legacy hybrid installations. It tends to get left out of cross-training materials because the failure mode only appears in high-traffic situations on stations with older junction infrastructure. She said nothing for a moment. Behind me, I heard the nav engineering team come out of corridor J7 and then very carefully not say anything. Admiral Sorville Ethan looked at me for what felt like a long time but was probably about 5 seconds. Then she looked past me at Tech Sorva, briefly, and then back at me. "Walk with me," she said. I walked with her. We walked through the maintenance level and up 2 decks to the station's operations bridge, which was in the particular state of controlled relief that follows a fault resolution. People releasing the tension they had been holding for 6 hours, moving more fluidly, talking in lower voices. The fault summary display on the main board showing a clean green and silver grid map of the station's nav relay network for the first time since midwatch. The fleet's mooring links were restoring one by one. 17 green indicators ticking into alignment, each one representing a warship getting its navigation grid back, each one representing a crew that could now maneuver safely. Overseer Seth Dawlow was standing at the central console, watching the nav grid display. He looked up when we came through the door. His expression, when he saw the Admiral and saw who was walking beside her, was something I would have paid a reasonable sum to photograph. "Overseer Dawlow," Admiral Sorville said, "your maintenance technician identified and resolved the cascade fault while my nav engineering team was still running diagnostics." Overseer Dawlow looked at me. I looked back at him. I did not say anything because I did not need to. "I see," the Overseer said carefully. "I would like to understand," the Admiral said, "why your Level II interface technician was not given access to the junction housing when she first identified the fault." There was a pause that had a great deal of content in it. "The nav engineering team was already engaged," the Overseer said. "I deferred to their assessment." "Their assessment was incorrect," the Admiral said, "and my fleet sat blind in a holding pattern for 6 hours. She said it without heat or drama, the way you state a fact that is inconvenient but not personal. She was not performing anger. She was documenting a problem, efficiently and precisely, in the presence of the person responsible for it. Then she turned to me and said, 'Ms. Oren, your station commander will hear a formal commendation from my office. Is there anything you need to complete your repair documentation?' "Just the firmware update process through the standard queue," I said. "I've already filed the request." "I'll prioritize it through fleet technical channels," she said. "It will be done before we depart." "Thank you, Admiral." She nodded, once, the precise, deliberate nod that in Vethal social convention carries about the same weight as a firm handshake, possibly more, and turned back to the operations console to begin her own briefing with the fleet's logistics staff on the resupply schedule. I stood there for a moment on the operations bridge, holding my tool bag, with Overseer Dallo looking at me from across the room with an expression I could not quite read. Then I went back to Bay 3 lower. I had a fuel line inspection to finish, and a fault resolution report to write up, and a cup of Vethol grain steep that had gone cold on my workbench probably 2 hours ago. I did not go back to the operations bridge that day. But I need to tell you about the rest of that day, because the rest of that day is where this story gets a little strange. Strange in a way I did not expect, and still do not entirely know what to make of. About an hour after I got back to my bay, Tech Sorva came to find me. He came alone. No portable console, no other team members, no official purpose that I could see. He walked into Bay 3 lower, looked around at the organized chaos of my workspace, parts crates stacked in their labeled rows, tools racked on the wall board, the half-finished fuel line inspection open on the frame in the center of the bay, my wrist screen propped against a spare fitting with the fault resolution report half-written on it, and found me on my stool at the workbench, adding notes to the report. "Mechanic Oren," he said. "Tech Sorva," I said. He stood there for a moment with the expression of someone who has prepared something to say, and is now deciding whether it still sounds right out loud. "The version 4.7 secondary reference indexing," he said. "I looked it up after you left the corridor. You were correct. It is in the Terran Interface Standard Documentation, subsection 11.4, buried in the compatibility notes for installations prior to the Unified Joint Protocol revision. We do not have that subsection in our standard training materials for Terran Interface systems." I put down my stylus. "Subsection 11.4 tends to get cut from the training materials," I said. "It only matters in hybrid installations with legacy junction infrastructure. Most people never encounter the failure mode." "You encountered it before," he said. "3 times," I said. "Twice in civilian dock infrastructure back on Terran colonial stations, once here on Ardith 7 in my first month, in a lower traffic version of the same fault. That one resolved without intervention because the traffic dropped back below threshold before the cascade spread far. Taught me where to look, though." He was quiet for a moment. He was not done. "You recognized it from experience," he said, "not from active documentation." "Experience cross-referenced against documentation I had read and retained," I said. "The documentation had to be there first. I just read further into it than the training materials took you." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not quite a smile. Tech Sorva did not seem like a man who smiled easily, or perhaps at all, but something in the neighborhood of acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of a person who takes precision seriously and has just heard an answer that is precise. "The Admiral's commendation to Overseer Dallo," he said after a moment. "She will also submit a commendation note to the Terran Vethal Joint Operations Oversight Board, citing your resolution of the fault. It will go into the joint record." He paused. "I thought you should know that." I looked at him. "I appreciate you telling me." "I also intend to file a documentation discrepancy report through fleet technical channels," he said, "flagging the missing subsection in our cross-training materials. Your name will be on it as the source who identified the gap." I had not expected that. "That's not required," I said. "No," he said, "but it is accurate." He nodded, a smaller, less formal version of the Admiral's nod, more like a confirmation than a ceremony, and left. I sat with that for a while. A formal commendation in the joint record is not nothing. It does not change what you do or who you are, but it goes somewhere that people occasionally look, and occasionally when people look at it and then look at you, they read what is in your coveralls a little differently. I am not sentimental about it. I did not fix the cascade fault to get a commendation, and I would have fixed it with or without the commendation. But I would be lying if I said it did not matter at all. What mattered more, actually, was not the commendation. It was Tech Sorva walking into my bay and telling me about it himself. He did not have to do that. Nobody told him to. He did it because he had gone back and looked up subsection 11.4 and it was there, exactly where I said it was, and that meant something to him enough that he came to find me. Not to apologize exactly. Not to justify himself. Just to acknowledge that the knowledge had been real, and the source of it had been standing in the corridor the whole time. I find that worth more than most of the formal recognitions I have ever received. The 7th Fleet's resupply took 2 more days. During those 2 days, I crossed paths with various members of the fleet's technical staff in the ways that you do on a station where multiple crews are working overlapping shifts in shared spaces. In the mess hall, in the corridors, at the shared maintenance terminals where human and Vethal technicians log their work orders. A few of them knew who I was, or had heard about the Cascade resolution. Most of them did not know and did not particularly care, which is also fine. I am not the kind of person who needs a corridor to part for her when she walks through it. The work is the same either way. On the 2nd day, something happened that I had not been expecting. I was in the station's small technical library, a room off the main operations level with a few terminals, and a collection of reference materials in both Terran and Vethal, mostly used by people cross-checking specifications mid-job, when one of the Admiral's staff officers came in and handed me a sealed data chip. "From Fleet Admiral Sorville Ethan," he said, "personal delivery per her instruction." I took the chip. He left. I sat there looking at the chip for a moment, and then I put it in the reader at the nearest terminal. It was a letter, written in Terran Standard. Personal, not official. The official commendation had already been filed through channels. This was something else. I will not transcribe it in full because it was not meant to be a public document. But the substance of it was this. The Admiral had spent the previous day reviewing the Joint Operations Station inspection, reports for Ardith 7 and 6 comparable stations in the sector, and in doing so had found that the translation junction documentation discrepancy I had identified, the missing subsection in the Vethal training materials, was replicated across every station in the cluster. Every Vethal technical team deployed to Joint Operations Stations was working from training materials that did not include the compatibility notes for legacy hybrid junction infrastructure, which meant the Cascade failure the 7th Fleet had experienced was not a one-time anomaly. It was a latent failure waiting to happen at any of 6 stations, and it would be triggered the next time any of those stations experienced a high-traffic navgrid demand. The Admiral had already initiated a documentation review through fleet technical channels. She expected the updated training materials to be issued within the month. At the bottom of the letter, after the formal close, there was a handwritten line. I say handwritten in Vethal. The equivalent is a personal stylus inscription in the digital margin, used when someone wants to make clear that a thing was added by their own hand and not by a staff officer. The line read, "I have noted in my personal log that the correction originated with a level II interface technician at Ardith 7, working from experience and from documentation that her Vethal counterparts had never been given. I intend to note this again, in whatever relevant forum presents itself, for as long as I command a fleet that operates with joint human Vethal crews. You identified the failure mode. The correction would not exist without that." I read that line twice. Then I filed the chip in my personal records, put the reader back on its cradle, and went back to work. The fleet departed the following morning. I was on shift in Bay 3 lower when the docking arm indicators showed all 17 ships clearing the station's navigation grid in clean sequential order. Address assignments clean. Mooring handshakes releasing and dropping away in the order the fleet maneuver plan required. The whole formation pulling into the deeper course that would take them toward the sector transit point, with the kind of smooth, unhurried precision that 17 capital warships achieve when their navigation grid is functioning correctly. I watched the indicator panel for a couple of minutes. I had a cup of something warm from the mess hall, not quite coffee, a Vethol grain-steeped drink that I had been consuming every morning for 3 years and had never entirely decided whether I liked. The taste was somewhere between malt and mineral, warming in the chest, slightly bitter on the finish. I had been meaning to ask someone what was in it. I had been meaning to do that for 3 years. I watched the formation clear the station's proximity zone. 17 bright green markers on the navigation display, moving clean and coordinated, no address collisions, no cascade fault indicators anywhere on the board. Just 17 very large ships going about their business, guided by a grid that was working the way it was supposed to work, because a patch cable was sitting in a junction housing 2 levels below me, bridging 2 terminals labeled J7S114 and J7S229. The cascade fault indicator at the top of my wrist screen display was blank. Had been blank since 3 minutes and 40 seconds into my 4-minute window in corridor J7. I finished my drink. I put the cup down. I picked up my inspection probe and went back to work. Some things I want to say, now that the main story is told, because I think they are worth saying. I've been doing this work for 19 years. In that time, I have been the only human on a Vethol station, the only woman in a maintenance bay, the only level II Terran-endorsed tech in a room full of people with higher formal credentials than mine. I have been told, politely and sometimes less politely, to go back to my bay, to stay in my lane, to let the qualified people handle it. I have been dismissed by people who looked at my coveralls before they listened to what I was saying, and I have learned, slowly, over many years, how to say what I know without the kind of heat that closes doors before anyone has a chance to open them. None of that is heroism. I want to be clear about that. I did not stand in corridor J7 as an act of courage or principle. I stood there because I had a patch cable in my kit and I knew it would work, and 17 ships were sitting blind in a holding pattern, and someone needed to say it again. That is all. The courage, if that word even applies, was just the ordinary stubbornness of someone who has been here before and knows that the problem will not fix itself. The thing I think about when I think about that day is not the Admiral's letter, though the letter is good. It is not the joint record commendation, though I am glad it exists. It is not even the moment the cascade fault alarm went quiet, though that moment was, I will admit, satisfying in a way that is hard to describe precisely. The thing I think about is Tech Sorva walking into my bay with his notes from subsection 11.4. He had looked it up. He had found it. He had come to tell me that it was there, and that I had been right not in those words, Tech Sorva not being the kind of person who used those exact words, but in a way that was entirely clear and required no decoding. He had done that because he was, underneath the credentials and the institutional reflex that had made him send me away the first time, an honest technician. He cared about knowing the right answer. He cared enough to go find it and then walk into a human mechanics bay and acknowledge it, at the end of a long shift with no one watching. I have worked with a lot of people in 19 years, human and Vethol and a handful of other species besides. The ones I remember are not the ones who got it right the first time. Getting it right the first time is good work, but it does not tell you much about a person. The ones I remember are the ones who got it wrong and then looked it up anyway. 6 weeks after the 7th Fleet departed, the updated Vethol training materials for hybrid joint operations station infrastructure were issued across the sector. I know this because a copy came to me directly, priority flagged through the Fleet technical channel, with a short note from the Admiral's office that said simply, "For your reference, the correction is documented." I downloaded the updated materials. I read through the new section on Terran Interface Standard Legacy Compatibility, which was now 14 pages long, and included a worked example of the address-stable overflow failure mode, with a clear schematic of the shunt cable patch procedure, and a table of the terminal pairs for all currently active hybrid architecture stations in the sector. The worked example described an incident at a joint operations tether station during a high-traffic nav-grid demand event. It described the fault mode, the cascade characteristics, the diagnostic approach that had failed to identify it, and the resolution procedure that had cleared it. It did not name the station. It did not name me. Technical documentation generally does not, and I had not expected it to. That is fine. I did not fix the cascade fault to be named in the documentation. I fixed it because it needed fixing and I had the cable in my kit. The documentation exists now. The next Vethal Nav engineering team that encounters this fault mode at a legacy hybrid station will have subsection 11.4 in their materials, and they will find the fault in 40 seconds instead of 6 hours. That is the thing that matters. The fix propagates. The knowledge becomes general instead of personal, available instead of buried, useful instead of sitting in one mechanic's salvaged files. That, honestly, is worth more than my name in a document. But somewhere in the official record, in the commendation note filed by Admiral Sorville Ethan, in the Joint Operations Oversight Board's incident log for Ardith 7, in Tech Sorva's documentation discrepancy report, in whatever personal log the Admiral keeps about her fleet's operational history, there is a line that places me there, in Corridor J7, with my salvaged patch cable and my scuff sleeve data contacts, and my 3 minutes and 40 seconds. That is enough for me. More than enough, honestly. I still have the cable. It is back in my kit. The firmware update came through 3 days after the fleet departed, processed fast, as promised, prioritized through fleet technical channels by a flag the Admiral's office placed on the work order, and the junction box no longer needs the shunt. I pulled the cable out, cleaned the data contacts, coiled it up, and put it back in the bottom of my bag. It still has the slightly scuffed sleeve near one end. I am still meaning to throw it away. But there is one more thing, and then I am done. About 2 months after the 7th Fleet's visit, I was in the mess hall at the end of a shift, eating something that was nominally described as a spiced grain bowl and was mostly fine, when Overseer Seth Dallow sat down across from me. He sat down in the way that indicated he had something to say and was going to say it, which was not his usual style. Dallow typically dealt with his maintenance staff through formal work orders and scheduled review meetings, not mess hall conversations. He set his own food tray down, which meant he was staying, which meant this was a conversation rather than a directive. I put down my spoon and waited. He said, "Your contract cycle comes up for renewal in 3 months. Yes, I said. I've processed a pre-authorization for a level III Vethal Interface Systems endorsement assessment for you. The assessment window opens next month at Ardith 9 once the station's back in service." He paused. Level III requires a Vethal co-signature for a human applicant. I've asked Tech Sorva to co-sign your candidacy application. He paused again. He agreed. Immediately, I'm told. I looked at Overseer Dallow. He looked back at me with the expression of someone who is waiting to see if an apology is required, and has decided that this is, in some ways, a more efficient form of one. He was not a cruel man. He had made the ordinary institutional error, and he knew it, and he was doing what he could about it now, in the straightforward, practical way that seemed to characterize how he handled most problems. I see, I said. You're the best Terran Vethal interface tech in this station cluster, he said, possibly in the sector. Level II is you are operating considerably above your certified level. You have been for some time by my read of the maintenance records. He paused. I should have acted on this before the fleet visit. I did not. I am acting on it now. But I thought about that for a moment. Thank you, Overseer, I said. The assessment itself is rigorous, he said. Level III is the Vethal co-endorsed ceiling for human technicians in joint operations installations. There are 37 active holders in the entire Terran Vethal joint operations network. I know what it is, I said. Yes, he said, I imagine you do. He pushed back from the table, picked up his food tray, and stood. The application paperwork is in your queue. Tech Sorva's co-signature is already attached. He paused one more time with the look of someone who is going to say the last thing and means it. You kept my station running for 3 years before any of this happened, Mechanic Oren. I should have been paying closer attention to what that meant. He left. I sat there for a while, not eating, looking at the spiced grain bowl that had stopped being interesting the moment Overseer Darlow had sat down. Then I picked up my spoon and ate my dinner, because I was hungry and I had a full shift in 6 hours, and a spiced grain bowl goes cold fast on Ardith 7, where the climate regulation in the mess hall has been running slightly under temp since before I arrived. I had been meaning to flag that for maintenance for 6 months. I made a note in my wrist screen, right there at the table, to add it to tomorrow's work queue. Some things are grand and some things are small, and the texture of a life in maintenance is mostly the small things. The fluid line inspections, the junction box schematics, the meal that goes cold before you get to it, the grease stain on the ceiling that was there before you arrived and will still be there when you leave. The grand things are real. The Admiral's letter is real. The fleet departing on a clean nav grid is real. I am not dismissing the grand things. But they sit on top of the small things, the way a tree sits on its root system, visible and tall and worthy of attention, but standing because of what is underneath. I fixed 17 warships with 12 meters of cable, and a junction shunt I was planning to throw away. I have been meaning to throw it away ever since. I am keeping it.